Before we get into the details, here is the big picture. The Philadelphia metro area is still operating in seller market territory, but for the first time in a while, spring inventory is showing a more noticeable lift. That means buyers may start to feel a little more breathing room, but supply still remains historically tight. Hi, I'm Neil DeFranco with the Larry DeFranco team at Elfont, Wissahick & Realtors. Each month, I take a look at what's happening nationally across the Philadelphia region and in the local markets where our team works most often. At the national level, this month's story is really about tension between two things. On one hand, mortgage rates remain volatile. On the other hand, affordability has still improved compared with where things stood a year ago. That matters because even with the uncertainty we continue to hear about the economy and overseas, buyers are still gradually re-engaging with the market. At the same time, seller activity is beginning to pick up just in time for spring. New listings nationally rose meaningfully from February to March, and buyer activity also improved. That suggests the spring market may have been delayed a bit, but not derailed. The last national point worth highlighting is pricing. Home prices are not crashing, but growth is flattening, and that means accurate pricing matters more than it did when almost anything would sell quickly. Now let's bring that down to the Philadelphia metro area. This is where the month got more interesting. New listings surged back into the market in March. The region added more than 7,400 new listings, which was up from a year ago and sharply higher than February. Pending sales were still slightly below last March, but they rebounded more than 40% from February's slower activity. So the metro story is not that demand disappeared, it's that spring was delayed and March looked much more like a spring market. At the same time, months of supply rose to just under 2 months. That is still tight by any historical standard, but it does suggest the market is moving a little closer to balance than it was at the peak of the frenzy. Prices also continued to rise, and the median days on market improved meaningfully from February, even though homes are still taking longer to sell than they were a year ago. The metro takeaway this month is pretty clear. Sellers are coming back, buyers are responding, and the market is becoming more active without becoming loose. Let's start locally with Springfield Township. Structurally, Springfield remains tight. Inventory has risen from where it sat at the end of winter, but months of supply is still very low, which tells us the market remains constrained. This is still not an easy market for buyers to navigate, even though there is a little more choice than there was a month or two ago. Momentum in Springfield is where the story gets more nuanced. March brought a stronger wave of new listings, while pendings came in lower than February and closings stayed steady. That tells me Springfield is active, but it is no longer the kind of environment where every properly exposed home is instantly absorbed without friction. There is still demand, but the increase in spring supply means sellers have to work a little harder to stand out. That leads directly into pricing discipline. Cumulative days on market moved higher, and in a market like Springfield, that usually tells us not that demand vanished, but that buyers are sorting more carefully between the homes that feel well-positioned and the homes that feel aspirationally priced. For sellers, the lesson is simple. More spring inventory means preparation and pricing matter even more. Mount Airy had one of the more noticeable spring shifts this month. Supply expanded sharply, inventory rose, new listings jumped, and months of supply moved up into a more moderate range. That does not make Mount Airy a buyer's market, but it does mean buyers are starting to have more choices and sellers are starting to face more competition. Momentum was strong in March. Closings rebounded significantly from February, and pendings also improved. That suggests real activity in the market, but not activity that is outrunning supply the way it did during the tightest periods of the last few years. In other words, Mount Airy is moving, but more inventory is coming with it. That is why pricing discipline becomes even more important here. Cumulative days on market remain high, and that often reflects exactly what many sellers do not want to hear. Buyers will still purchase, but they are willing to wait for the right house at the right number. In Mount Airy, this month, rising supply gives buyers more room to choose, which means sellers need to be realistic from the start. Chestnut Hill remains a smaller, higher-priced market, so the numbers will always be more volatile. But even here, the spring pattern is showing up. Inventory increased meaningfully from both last month and last year, and months of supply moved up as well. That said, the luxury segment is still relatively constrained because the total number of homes on the market remains small. Momentum improved, closings rose, new listings increased, and pendings held at a level that suggests buyers are still engaging with the market. So the story here is not softness, it is increased momentum in a small market where each additional listing matters. For pricing discipline, Chestnut Hill is still Chestnut Hill. Luxury pricing rewards precision. Even though cumulative days on market improved from some of the more distorted months we saw last year, this is still a segment where the right price and positioning matter enormously because the buyer pool is smaller and more analytical. So what does all of this mean? Across the region, spring inventory is improving, but supply is still tight enough to support sellers. For sellers, preparation creates leverage. For buyers, more choice rewards discipline. And for the overall market tone, supply is improving, but it's still historically tight. If you're thinking of buying or selling and want to talk through how these trends apply to your specific neighborhood or property, feel free to reach out. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again next month.